You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
It's interesting to try and understand what drives national security, a strategy for national security. There was this old Greek bloke who had a pretty complex name. I'm not going to pronounce it at the risk of sounding like I'm saying something explicit, but he talked a little bit about fear, honour and interest. And that got me thinking, particularly about the fear bit. What happens when a national strategy is driven by a fear of something that may occur? I guess that kind of makes sense, because you're not going to prepare for the best. A national strategy built on hope, kind intentions, and you first may not necessarily be what a successful state's looking to establish. G'day listeners, it is your host Mick here with the Dead Prussian podcast. Welcome back, thank you very much. We've cracked the 40 episode mark, we're well into the 40s now, so quite humbled that people are still listening. People are still downloading. I don't really know if you're listening, but my stats only need you to download, so keep doing that, crack on and keep listening. Also, thank you for purchasing the merchandise. I'd love to see more photos of those coffee cups and t-shirts up on Twitter, they're quite good. And if you send them to me in private, please stop sending the underwear ones, because that's not what the show's about. Also, thank you very much for the iTunes reviews. I've noticed a few popping up around the globe. That's right, around the globe. We're a global phenomenon, as is podcasting and the internet. Now, I talked a little bit in the intro about fear, and it's mainly because someone's written a book on fear of invasion and how that affects national strategy. That someone is Dr. David Morgan-Owen. Dave is a lecturer in Defence Studies at King's College London. He's based out at the Joint Services Command and Staff College. He's a historian by trade and gained his BA, MA and PhD from the University of Exeter. That's quite an efficient job to get it all done in one spot. He studied there between 2005 and 2013. Some of you may know that he's published widely on British strategy before and during the First World War. That's not to say he was publishing before the First World War or during the First World War, but that's the period he publishes about. Cultivating in this, his first book, which is coming out with Oxford University Press in July, which is probably this month if I get my scheduling right, is about that very time period. David, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey mate, thank you very much for having me. I'm a long-time listener, so very pleased to be here.
It's good to hear a long-time listener, because there's a few of them around. Most of them listen to the show once, and then I get new listeners. But David, before we discuss 34 years of British strategic policy, which I'm pretty sure we can get done in the time it takes for listeners to get off the treadmill, can you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, how you became a historian, and why British strategic history, apart from your accent, is one of your interests?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So as a long-time listener to this show, I've obviously heard you ask questions like this to other people, and I've been really impressed by the kind of sensible, well-thought-out justifications that people have given for how they've come to study a given topic. I unfortunately don't really have one of those. It was kind of a series of unfortunate accidents, culminating in me being quite lucky to stumble into what was a really good department down at Exeter that had a particular strength in particularly the naval side of strategy, but with people there like sort of Jeremy Black, etc., in the history of war whilst I was a student there. So that kind of gave me a bit of a handrail on which to limp along until I got into the beginning of the PhD and began to get some sort of more ideas of my own about precisely where I wanted to take this. In terms of the strategy part, that again really came along kind of by accident and relatively sort of late in the day. As I'm sure some of your other guests and my colleague in the department here, Hugh Davis, has talked about, so much of people's interest in history, I think, is motivated by the personal. Like, you find someone that you're interested in. And for me, that was a couple of people. It was a guy called Sir John Fisher and also Herbert Richmond, two admirals that were involved in one way or another in British strategy during the First World War, and kind of through finding them quite interesting, I kind of got into what I'm doing now.
It's interesting. I also noticed that being at the Joint Services Command and Staff College, you might also have a bit of a penchant for torturing students. Am I correct in saying that?
I couldn't possibly comment, although I have taught one or two of your countrymen over the course of the last couple of years. So you have to ask them.
Everything they said about me is not true. All right, let's get into it, David. Let's talk about the book that you've got coming out. And well, actually, let's not talk about it. I don't really want to know about the page density or the font size, but let's talk about the topic. And I'm quite glad that the book actually covers off on today's topic, because it'd be quite awkward if it didn't. Can you give the listeners a once-over lightly on the book and your premise in the book?
Yeah, of course. So what really brought me to this question when I was kind of casting around in the early days of thinking about a PhD was that both the Army and the Navy in the kind of 3 or 4 decades before the First World War seem to talk quite a lot about this sort of threat of invasion. They do so in quite different circumstances and in quite different ways over that period of time. So sometimes it's something that they're very, very worried about and they're very keen to play up the threat of invasion. And other times they're quite keen to sort of distance themselves from it and to say maybe there isn't so much of a danger. So that kind of inconsistency over time and between both sides of the debate seemed like an interesting thing for me to kind of get into. So that's where I started. Where I kind of washed up after the research and writing the book was that, in my view, discussions over the threat of invasion and the role that the government played in those played a very important and generally underrated role in shaping what we would call British grand strategy before 1914. Now, this becomes clear when you look at what each of the services were doing in parallel. So rather than kind of looking top down at what the government is saying, you actually kind of compare what the two are doing, how those two things interact with each other, and then when the government may come along and sort of tip the scales one way or the other. So simply put, the argument of the book is that discussions about invasion played a more significant part in determining British strategy than you might expect, given that there wasn't a seemingly imminent threat, for 3 reasons. The first, that defending the British Isles was an area where both the Army and Navy had a role and their activities kind of overlapped. And so if you make a decision on that, it has knock-on effects for the kind of relative positions of the Army and Navy. The second reason was that the level of force deemed necessary to protect Britain was kind of like the starting off point from which you made any other decisions about strategy, particularly in terms of military manpower. So how many men can you send to India? How many men can you send to South Africa, or whatever else you might want to do? And the final reason was that home defence and invasion was a question that had the greatest amount of public and political prominence in this period, and therefore was discussed the most by politicians and had the most attention paid to it. So basically, how to defend Britain was the issue that the government paid the most attention to, and by doing so, it played a really important role in shaping the activities of the two services in a manner approaching what we would refer to as grand strategy.
It's interesting. So obviously that's where the title comes from, fear of invasion. Now, was this the main threat in the period of 1880 to 1914? I mean, the British Empire was quite big. So is that where people were going to hit them?
Well, this is a question very much of sort of where you stand determines where you sit. And it was a very live kind of debate at the time. So invasion was certainly used by some people as a way of trying to get the public interested in defence when they were actually really much more worried about something else. So you get people quite explicitly mentioning behind the scenes that what we're actually worried about is an invasion of Russia, and we need enough men and an efficient enough army to send to India to fight the Russians. However, the only way to get the public to pressure the government into giving us an army capable of doing that is to present a threat to the public that will actually incite them to be interested in this. And that threat is very much the threat of invasion. It's more tangible than some of these imperial threats. But you're completely right. So in the period kind of between about 1880 and 1900, undoubtedly Britain's most worried about the prospect of a war with France and or Russia, or after 1890, both in combination. This would be doubly difficult because you'd obviously have the French, who are very close to Britain and be able to threaten the sea lanes going into Britain and maybe to threaten an invasion. And then the northwest frontier of India, where the British would need to send as many men as they could as quickly as possible in order to kind of forestall a Russian invasion. As the time period goes on, though, the threat of France is obviously kind of diminishing by the signing of the Entente Cordiale in 1904. And after 1905, 1906, and the sort of collapse of Russia following the defeats in the Russo-Japanese War, the threat of Russia kind of abates to an extent, although it never goes away as well. What rises during that period in the mind of kind of people thinking about British strategy is the threat from Germany, and particularly the German army is obviously notoriously effective. It's, how the Prussians defeated the French in 1870 is kind of the legend of all staff colleges around Europe. But the rise of the German Navy after 1898 and 1900 is kind of a new element in the equation. So I guess one of the key findings of the book is that after 1905, the British Admiralty very quickly get very worried about the Navy's ability to prevent a German invasion for a whole host of kind of technical reasons. And that this concern, combined with the government tacitly supporting the idea of sending the British Army to support the French in the event of a Franco-German war, really constrained how the Navy was thinking about how it could fight in the North Sea and about how it could play a role in a war against Germany.
It's interesting, your phrase, two phrases I found interesting. One, the bit where you said I was completely right, which means you're falling out of tradition with all previous guests, but I like it. I think it's a good new tradition to start. But also, where you stand is where you sit. And I guess that goes on to my next question about the main ways and means, I guess, the British hadn't used to develop their strategy against this threat.
So again, this is something that kind of changes during the period.
Yep.
In many ways, it's quite problematic to talk about. So I've caveated a couple of things I've said already with what we'd refer to today as grand strategy.
Yeah.
The word strategy kind of comes into regular usage in Britain in the sort of 1870s and 1880s, but they're quite reticent in forming the kind of institutional manifestations of that we kind of would recognise today, like the National Security Council, etc. What they do after quite a long period of debate and argument in the 1880s and 1890s is they form something called the Committee of Imperial Defence in December of 1902.
Yep.
Now, this is meant to be a body which quite a lot of today's organisations, if you read the literature, claim to be sort of modelled on, where you'd have senior politicians, the political heads of the two services, and then senior military professionals that could provide advice, and the government would then be able to decide and coordinate where to send resources, what the relative balance between the Army and Navy should be, what the priorities in various areas were. Now, this is quite a new formation when it's set up. It's quite a remarkable leap from how some of the structures of British government have worked before then. There are certainly problems with it, foremost being that it derives its authority from the fact that the Prime Minister is the chair. So this basically means that if you have a good Prime Minister or an interested Prime Minister who has a capacity to do that kind of coordinating role, the committee can work quite well. Now, this is what happens initially. So the guy that is the prime mover in setting up the Committee of Imperial Defence is Arthur Balfour. And he's Prime Minister between 1902 and the end of 1905. And in that initial period, Balfour actually demonstrates that this way of making strategy can work really well. So the two big questions that he addresses, which were very long-running questions, were what should the role of the Army and Navy be in preventing invasion? And then how many men should Britain commit to sending to India if the Russians were to start encroaching into the northwest frontier. Now, these issues have been batted back and forth between the Army and Navy for most of the 1890s, reaching back into the 1880s, and they hadn't been able to reach a conclusion because fundamentally they didn't have anyone to kind of arbitrate. What Balfour does is he comes in, he uses his advisors to give him sensible appreciations of the situation, and then he makes decisions. Many of the decisions were not completely perfect, but he did a pretty credible job, in my view, of doing the best he could with what he had for the time. So I view that as being relatively good. After that, a new government comes in 1906. Now, this is a Liberal government that runs on a platform of social welfare and retrenchment, and the Prime Minister between 1906 and 8 is quite staunchly anti-militarist, a real kind of radical politician. And for a range of reasons, the Liberal government is just less interested in and less capable of making those big decisions about strategy than Balfour had been before 1905. Now, that's talking in pretty broad brushstrokes about a long period and lots of people. Yep. But the average result is that after 1906, the committee becomes less and less effective, and you kind of revert back to a situation that you had before it was put into place, where both of the services are kind of pursuing their own independent policy, and the two kind of interact with each other, but in an unmanaged and sometimes quite contradictory fashion. And that's kind of the situation that you get down to in 1914.
Inter-service rivalry for budgetary resources. I'm in utter disbelief. Now, Dave, it seems like there was a bit of toing and froing, talking about the committee's effectiveness, then it being pushed to the side. I guess my question is, and I know I'm going to suffer here because I'm asking a historian to talk in general terms, but generally, how prepared did this period, the whole 34 years, make Britain for the catastrophe of 1914?
Well, it's an interesting question to answer. I suppose it depends whether you're comparing it relative to other powers or against what it might have been. Mm-hmm. So, generally speaking, I think historians' view of the structures that Britain had created before 1914 compared to what existed in the other powers is pretty positive. Yep. And I think you can make a good case that the Committee of Imperial Defence and sort of the principles upon which it was based, even if they hadn't fully developed before 1914, were kind of an important seed for what developed afterwards. However, I would probably take a slightly more conservative view based upon the fact that the committee had shown that it could work much better than it did in 1914 between 1903 and 1905. So at the outbreak of war, reaching out for a quote here, there's never need to go much further than Winston Churchill. Soon after the outbreak of war, Churchill, who's in charge of the Admiralty at this point, apparently is sort of steaming down the corridors of the Admiralty, bumps into Herbert Richmond, the guy I mentioned earlier, who's in the operations room at that time. Churchill apparently says to him, "Now we have our war. The next thing is to decide how we're going to carry it on." And that kind of, it's a little bit facetious to drop it in because he was slightly talking across purposes, but it kind of captures something about the essence of what had happened before 1914. And I think the degree of kind of uncertainty that existed had two particularly unfortunate effects for how Britain entered the war in terms of making strategy. The first was that the failure of the committee to move beyond and break through this very stiff inter-service rivalry that as you alluded to, had developed, meant that there was no real meaningful discussion of how combined or amphibious operations could have formed a part of British strategy in a war against Germany. Now, that's not to say that combined or amphibious operations would have been the right thing to do, but it seems unfortunate to have not had the option through purely not actually have really appreciated the question in a systematic way. Now, you see the effects of this very soon after the outbreak of war, when the cabinet get together and everyone's trying to, with the military and naval leaders, are going to try and decide what to do with the army. And the question gets asked, well, can we send the army to Antwerp rather than straight over to France? And the answer is no, we can't, because the Navy can't actually protect the transports. So even things as simple as that, that's not an opposed landing or anything as dramatic as that.
Yeah.
You see seeds in there of what was going to go on and happen at Gallipoli.
Yeah.
And I think, sorry,
continue.
You go. I think the second unfortunate aspect is that the services were very much both pulling in slightly sort of different directions by the time it came to 1914.
Yep.
And this created some pretty significant inefficiencies within the whole of what you might describe as British strategy. So to a great extent, the Navy had become overtly defensive in its focus in order to support the 6 divisions of the British Expeditionary Force going to the continent. Now, that might have been the right thing to do, again, but it was never explicitly decided upon by the government. And to adopt a strategy where your definitely most expensive and probably most globally significant force, that being the Navy, was kind of put in second place in order to send 6 divisions, which in the sort of on the scales of what was going on in the continent is pretty inconsequential across to France. I think that needed a greater degree of actual explicit discussion than occurred before 1914. So in this lack of really getting to the bottom of some of these issues and making these important decisions, that came to kind of foreshadow, I think, some of the pretty chaotic decision making that characterized British policy for the first 18 months of the First World War.
Now, you mentioned Gallipoli, but we're not going to talk about that because I'm a bit of a fan of Gallipoli myth-busting, and we're not going to get into the debate on this episode. That's a pretty good summary of 34 years, so I would commend you, but I'm going to wait for your final answer to the final question before any commendations are handed out. Now, also, because you're an instructor, a lecturer at the Staff College, you're not allowed to give Big Carl's answer to the final question. Now, new listeners, you're asking, what is that answer? Well, grab a book and look it up. Now, the final question, though, is every guest pays the price of coming on the show by offering a definition of war. And they do this by finishing the sentence, war is. So, David, war is?
Before I give you that answer, I would point out that this does get more and more difficult the more people that you have on the show. So I've thought of myself, what would I say about this before? And a number of other people have stolen my answers.
Yeah,
so
no cheating.
Hopefully this one won't have happened on an episode that I might have missed for whatever reason. But, okay, so war is, I think, too important to be left to the military.
That's a really good one. Strikes at the heart of some of my listeners, but it's probably pretty right. I'm not sure if anyone's had that before, but I also doubt that you've ever missed an episode anyway, because you said you're a long-time listener. David, thank you very much for coming on the show. Thank you for providing a definition that I can tweet as well. Not that I ever tweet my guests once, I just tell them that to make them feel good. But thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Mick. It's been a pleasure.
Now, listeners, we don't do these things just for fun. We do these podcasts because we like hearing our voices. That's not true. We also like to encourage debate, and a good way to encourage debate is to educate yourself. So please, keep an eye out for David's book. It is The Fear of Invasion, Strategy, Politics and British War Planning, 1880 to 1914, and it is published by Oxford University Press, out July 2017, which by the time this goes to air should be in the middle of or past. And David, you've got another project coming up, I read?
Yeah, so kind of moving on some of the ideas I've been looking at in this into the wartime period itself, and maybe trying to ask some slightly more fundamental sort of questions about why it was that invasion seemed to have so much traction in kind of public discussion in Britain, and what effect that might have had on how Britain fought the First World War.
That sounds fantastic, and just like Jackie Fisher, it sounds like you'll return. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at DeadPrussianPod, on Facebook at The Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.